Hey everybody, welcome to the Week 4 Overview Lecture. In this lecture I'm going to talk about the 15 or so years after World War II to pick up the story where we left it off in Week 3. As always, I'll be organizing everything around the 5 major themes, and at the beginning of each one I'll highlight the sections of American Yop where you can get some more detail on each of these topics, which I'll cover, as always, as quickly and broadly as I can. So the first theme I want to look at for Week 4 is who is an American? And basically I just want to look at the kind of origins of the civil rights movement. Some of this will be pretty famous stuff you probably learned about in the past. And then next week we'll get to some of the really iconic 1960s civil rights era stuff. So to start, I want to kind of backtrack a little bit to World War II. We talked about World War II back in Unit 3. Here are some sections of American Yop that bear on this stuff as well. But I want to kind of take us back a few years, back into World War II. A lot of historians would argue that World War II is this really important turning point and kind of accelerant for the civil rights era and the civil rights movement. So I'm going to start there. You know, if you think about World War II, where the United States is fighting against Italy and Japan, especially Nazi Germany, abroad we're fighting against this very obvious racist enemy in Nazi Germany. And so a lot of people in the United States pointed out, our track record on this topic isn't exactly perfect. And so a lot of activists for civil rights noticed that this is an opportunity, that we can highlight the idea that here we are talking this big game about liberty and equality and fighting racism, fighting prejudice, and yet racism and prejudice continue to exist in the United States. And so civil rights activists called this strategy the Double V campaign, V standing for victory, where the first of the two V's in the Double V is victory against our enemies abroad, again against Nazi Germany, against Japan and Italy, but also securing victories here at home. And again, by doing, one way to do that is to really, again, highlight America's ideals, the things we're allegedly fighting for abroad, and point out that we could certainly be shoring up our track record at home on these same topics. So if you look at a picture like this, we see this sort of steely-eyed Nazi officer, but reflected in his eye is a hanged person, right? A lynched person. At this time, we talked about back in previous weeks, enormous numbers of lynchings of African Americans, especially men, have been going on in the United States for decades and continued into the World War II period. So there's all this effort to use the war, and even before that, back to the New Deal era, to highlight continued prejudice, continued racism, continued racially motivated violence aimed at African Americans, and sort of, again, hold up America's image and show ways in which America is falling short of that image. A famous example of that was the work of a guy named A. Philip Randolph, who was an African American labor leader. He was putting pressure on Franklin Roosevelt to do something about civil rights, and one of the things he proposed was for African Americans to march to Washington, D.C. Now, if that sounds familiar, that will happen later in 1963, leading to the famous I Have a Dream speech and all that. We'll talk about that in the Week 5 lecture. Randolph never actually did this, but this idea that we're going to march to Washington, D.C. to highlight continued racism and prejudice, put pressure on the government to do something about it, that's going on as early as the early 1940s. And A. Philip Randolph was influential on the march that did occur a couple decades later. And this did bear some fruit. The United States did pass legislation that basically banned companies from discriminating against black workers during World War II. If you think back to the Week 3 lecture I talked about during World War II, there's all this industrial production and the economy really gets humming. A lot of those companies who were hiring often had pursued discriminatory practices. A. Philip Randolph's efforts helped the United States at least pass a law that called for racial equality in hiring. It wasn't always lived up to in practice, but at least the structure is there to prevent racism in hiring. And what we'll see in this World War II and just after World War II period is things start to kind of loosen up around civil rights. Right? We've got cultural examples like Jackie Robinson, famously the first African-American baseball player in Major League Baseball, joined the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. And this is kind of a big social victory, this idea that baseball fans can turn on their television or go to a game and see black and white players playing next to each other, seeing Jackie Robinson's white teammates simply treat him as an equal. All this stuff is kind of getting the ball rolling a little bit for the much more full-fledged civil rights stuff we'll talk about later. That said, Jackie Robinson was the target and victim of enormous amounts of racial and racist hatred. This is just one of the many, many notes that he received threatening his life and his safety. You can view some of this stuff at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown if you're ever there. Another really important landmark that's in this period, just after World War II, is the desegregation of the military. Up to this point in every American war since the American Revolution, soldiers have been fighting in racially separated units. That ended in just after World War II, setting up the Korean War, which we'll talk about a little later in this lecture. This is another huge deal, kind of like with Jackie Robinson. This provides day-to-day interaction between black and white people. Very often racism was born out of ignorance. So to have black and white men living and fighting side by side, noticing their similarities rather than their differences. Again, all of this is sort of culturally laying the groundwork for the civil rights efforts to come. Another big factor in this, we'll talk about the Cold War later in this lecture, but a lot of the reason I would say that civil rights action really did accelerate after World War II had to do with something that seems kind of unrelated, which is the Cold War, America's kind of global struggle against communism and against the Soviet Union. It might seem like those things have nothing to do with each other, but the Cold War put a lot of pressure on the United States to do something about its race problem because countries like the Soviet Union, one way to think about the Cold War is it's kind of competition, right? We've got communists over here, we've got us over here, and we want as many friends as possible, and so do they, as many allies as possible. So one thing that the Soviet Union could do, for example, is broadcast propaganda to countries around the world where people of color lived and say, look, the United States is telling you they're this beacon of freedom, and yet people are segregated there, people are lynched there. So American politicians, they don't want to make that criticism valid. So that kind of accelerates this effort to civil rights, right? They don't want to give the Soviet Union this kind of propaganda victory, this propaganda talking point, by highlighting racism that continues in the United States, even as we're, again, kind of like with the double V idea, talking this big game about equality and not really living up to it at home. You've also got efforts in legal channels, mostly to attack segregation. If you think back to an earlier lecture, we talked about Plessy versus Ferguson and the idea of separate but equal. Sorry, just a second, I'm getting a phone call. Sorry about that. Okay, so another kind of effort in civil rights struggles in this period was to deal with this problem of segregation, right? This law has been on the books, this Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson has been on the books for a long time, saying basically segregation is fine as long as the facilities are equal. Now in reality, everybody knew the facilities were not equal, but it was just very difficult and time-consuming to attack that problem. One group that was doing that is the NAACP through its Legal Defense Fund. Their most famous lawyer was Thurgood Marshall, who later became the first African-American on the Supreme Court. And what they did is basically demonstrate, hey, separate but equal is not being lived up to. And so they were able to win court cases on the local level, say, look, these two schools are not equal, these facilities are not equal. And they could win legal victories like that, but it's just very time-consuming to be going place to place, issue by issue, dealing with this. So the long-term goal was to attack segregation more broadly. And one of the arenas in which they pursued that was in schools. Because again, it was very obvious that very often segregated schools were not equal. But the goal of the NAACP became to show that segregated facilities can never be equal in a true sense. And so to do that, to address that problem, they start with adults, like graduate schools. And there's a really watershed moment here in Texas at the University of Texas Law School, where the UT Law School had admitted a black student named Heman Sweat. You see him pictured here. But when he showed up to go to law school at UT, he was given no access to the UT Law Library. He was told, well, you can go to this other law library in the Capitol building. That'll be good enough for you. He wasn't allowed to attend class with other white students, so he was basically taught in the basement separately from all the other students. So it was very obvious he was not receiving an equal experience of his education, and so the NAACP was able to win this case too. And so they're kind of chipping away at this idea that separate can never be equal. And the really, really landmark case here is what we call Brown versus Board of Education. It's actually a whole cluster of cases grouped together. Brown was the first alphabetically, so that's the name we tend to give it. But the goal of the NAACP here kind of shifted to show this isn't just about Linda Brown, this isn't just about one school system. This is to show that separate can never be equal. That when you've got a segregated system, and it's very obvious who is the sort of powerful included group and who is the powerless excluded group, you're never going to have true equality. Another really important part of this case is the lawyers who just draw on legal precedent, because the legal precedent said segregation is okay. They did stuff like psychological studies, where they would give, for example, black and white children different colored dolls. You see an image of that here. And what they discovered was that segregated black students kind of internalized feelings of inferiority that could be teased out through these psychological tests. And so the lawyers could show the court, look, we can say these facilities are equal, but by separating one group out from the other, we're communicating to that group that you are not equal, that you are inferior, and that students who come up in a system like that are going to internalize that. And because they sort of laid this groundwork with court cases for years, the NAACP was able to successfully wage this war. The Supreme Court decided unanimously that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. And this is still just the beginning of a struggle. We'll talk more about this in the next week's lecture. But this is a major, major moment that starts to crumble the whole structure of segregation in the United States. So again, we'll pick up that story in week 5. Another really important phenomenon going on in the years after World War II is the Cold War. And if you think back to World War II, the Soviet Union, the big communist nation in the world at that time, was our ally, and in fact did most of the heavy fighting in Europe, that lost far more people than the United States did in World War II fighting the Nazis. Now, after the war, the two countries start to look at each other with suspicion, basically because they're operating two really different systems. Right? The United States is rooted in democracy and capitalism, whereas the Soviet Union is rooted in this philosophy of communism. More on the Cold War. Here are a couple sections in chapter 25 to deal with that. I wanted to start, I'll go back to that previous slide in a second, but just a basic definition of communism. You can read that here. But the idea is basically, capitalism is based on private property and the profit motive, that the system works best if we are striving to maximize return on investment and corporate profit, private property ownership, that's how the system will succeed. Whereas under communism, the idea is that the means of production and property and major industries are basically publicly owned and shared. Now, again, that's more a theory than a reality in a lot of cases, but that's the basic idea. You can read the definition here for the technical definition of communism. If you think about the Soviet Union, it was born in 1917, and from the very beginning, the United States actually sent soldiers to Russia to resist the communist takeover there during the kind of civil war that followed the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So from the very beginning, the Soviet Union recognized the United States as kind of an enemy, right, who had acted against its creation decades earlier. And yet, in the 1930s, 1940s, the Soviet Union and the United States shared an enemy, which is Nazi Germany. So for this brief little interval, they're working together. But then after the war ends and that marriage of convenience ends, the suspicion comes back. One other factor that's sort of hanging over this is the atomic bomb. We talked about this in the week 3 lecture. The United States had developed this atomic bomb during World War II. While that was going on, the United States did share with Great Britain that they were working on it, and the Great Britain and the United States were kind of collaborating to some extent in the Manhattan Project. The Soviet Union was totally frozen out of that. So they only found out right before the bomb was dropped that we even had it. And a lot of historians even argue that one of the reasons we dropped the atomic bomb wasn't just to defeat Japan, but also to intimidate the Soviet Union. So there's this kind of level of suspicion there too of the United States, even though the Soviet Union's doing almost all the heavy fighting for years in Europe, that we're withholding secrets from them, and that we're in fact even trying to intimidate them with our atomic policy. So as soon as World War II ends, two start to kind of divide the world. And the way the United States interprets this, they have this sort of idea about communism, which is that its primary goal is expansion, that it's headquartered in Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, and that global communism is this kind of conspiracy orchestrated from Moscow, bent on global expansion and conquest. Now that's certainly a debatable point. Scholars to this day kind of disagree on how aggressive the Soviet Union was. Of course, they would argue they were just being kind of protective of their own interests by expanding control over neighboring countries. But the United States, they look at the Soviet Union, and they see aggressive expansion. And so the philosophy the United States developed to deal with this was called containment, which is just what it sounds like. We're going to contain communism to where it already exists, and if we can do that, its internal problems will rot it out and destroy it from within, which in a way is what will happen decades later. So to pursue containment, the United States has this sort of three-pronged approach to prevent the Soviet Union from spreading as much as possible. One part of that is called the Truman Doctrine. This is basically the philosophy behind the Cold War, which is that wherever we see the threat of the Soviet Union expanding, or of communism in general expanding, the United States is going to do whatever it takes to prevent that. This began with America pumping money and resources into Greece and Turkey to try to prevent communism from spreading there. But basically, later we'll look at Korea, next week we'll look at Vietnam. All of this is kind of based on this Truman Doctrine idea that wherever communism threatens to spread, the United States needs to do whatever it needs to do to stop it. As we'll see, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. So we can kind of think of the Truman Doctrine as the philosophical underpinning of containment. With that is something called the Marshall Plan. This is the kind of economic prong of the containment plan. What the Marshall Plan basically did was pump money into primarily European countries. The idea being if we keep those countries stable and prosperous, they're not going to be as vulnerable to communism as a place that is struggling or vulnerable might be. So the United States essentially paid the money it took to rebuild Europe after World War II, kind of get those countries on our side, keep their economies stable, so that people in Europe won't flirt with the idea that maybe communism is a better system. The idea was we prop those countries up, they're not going to think that way. And to a large extent, this proved to be the case, and the Marshall Plan was really instrumental in rebuilding Europe after it was largely destroyed in World War II. So you've got the kind of philosophy of the Truman Doctrine, the economic plan of the Marshall Plan. The third component of this is NATO. We actually hear quite a bit about NATO in the news today. President Trump is pretty kind of obsessed, I would say, with the United States and its relationship with NATO. NATO is basically this alliance that began as an alliance of non-communist, at this point, Western European nations. It has spread to other nations since this map. But the idea was that non- or anti-communist countries, like the United States and Western Europe, need to get each other's backs. And if any of them is threatened by Soviet or communist expansion, let's say a nation is invaded by the Soviet Union, if that's a NATO member nation, the idea is that all members of NATO will rally to its defense. Again, this has come up a lot, in particular with Ukraine and Ukraine's relationship or potential relationship with NATO over the last few years. Again, you can research some of that on your own if you're interested. So if you put those three things together, you get this sort of containment state, right? We're going to pump money into vulnerable nations. We're going to provide military backing to vulnerable nations, all of which is designed to prevent communism from expanding. So this is all being built up in the late 1940s and the years after World War II. And yet, by the end of the 1940s, there's some really troubling developments from the American perspective. So first, if you think about the atomic bomb, the United States developed theirs in 1945. It was widely assumed it would take decades for any other country to develop one, especially the Soviet Union. And yet, 4 years later, we were able to discover that the Soviet Union had an atomic bomb of its own. So now, what had been a really lopsided relationship is now basically equal, and both countries have the potential to obliterate the other. So that raises the stakes way up in the Cold War. But in a weird way, it also kind of made both sides afraid of direct confrontation. Right? If everybody knows that if one false move, one conflict can lead to nuclear missiles flying in both directions, that has tended and actually successfully avoided massive military conflict between these countries. So that's sort of bad sign number one in 1949, which people look back on as known as the Year of Shocks. Bad sign number two is in 1949, the most populated country in the world, China, fell to communism. And so here we are trying to contain the spread of communism, and yet communism spread to the most populous country in the world. So for scorekeepers in 1949, things are not looking good. Geographically, the biggest country in the world is the Soviet Union, communist. Population-wise, the biggest country in the world is China, communist. So there's a lot of kind of finger-pointing and a lot of hand-wringing. What is going wrong? What are we doing? Who let this happen? People are kind of panicking in the late 1940s and certainly not confident that the United States is in a position to win the Cold War at that point. Of course, they don't know, we know, that there's still decades more of Cold War to come. So we call this the Cold War because the major powers, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, never went to war against each other. But what ends up happening is conflict is played out in what we might call proxy wars. And around the world, any place where communism might spread, the U.S. backs the anti-communist side, the Soviet Union and or China backs the communist side, and so we get war on the ground in those countries. Again, the probably most famous example of that is Vietnam. We'll talk about that next week. But kind of a dress rehearsal for Vietnam is the war in Korea. And I'm not going to go too much into the details of this, but the short version is North Korea was aligned with communism, especially China. South Korea was highly aligned with the United States. They're kind of looking at each other across this, what's known as the demilitarized zone, in this weird state of stalemate. But in 1950, violence broke out there, and we had this kind of seesaw battle in which tens of thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Korean people died. 3 years later, when the Korean War was kind of technically paused, technically it was never truly ended, we're in the exact same situation we started in. Whereas we've got North Korea aligned with China, which is still true to this day, and South Korea aligned with the United States, which is still true to this day. And so Korea to this day is a major kind of potential point of global conflict. And again, you can look into more of that on your own. Read the sections of American Yop on the actual war itself. Another important part of the Cold War from the United States perspective is what we might call covert action. That we're doing very obvious things like fighting the war in Korea, but a lot of the Cold War was fought in more secretive ways through organizations like the CIA. The CIA in particular got involved with pretty shady stuff starting in the 40s and 50s, rigging elections, toppling governments. Just to give you a couple examples of the CIA operating what we call the Third World, that term's sort of outdated now. That's a Cold War term. I'm sure you've heard that term where, from the American perspective, we are the first world. The Soviet Union is the second world. They're the two big powers. And then everybody else, sort of the largely kind of poor nations of the world, are the third world. And the United States and the Soviet Union both want as many allies as possible in those countries. That's what I was alluding to when I talked about Cold War civil rights before. And very often, wherever there's the idea that communism might take over in a country, the United States is either going to get obviously, openly involved, like in Korea, or more covertly involved in places like Iran, where Iran's leader was essentially toppled with the CIA's help, and a leader called the Shah was installed. We'll pick up that story. The Shah was much more aligned with a pro-American, pro-Western political attitude. He'll be in power to the late 70s. We'll kind of pick up that story in a future lecture. A year later in Guatemala, the United States functionally toppled a democratically elected government and installed a pro-American dictator. This is generally the pattern where in a lot of countries in the world in this period in the 50s and 60s, countries had left-leaning, democratically elected governments and leaders that the United States often pretty directly toppled or removed and installed very often right-wing dictators that were allowed to be in power because they had anti-communist, pro-U.S. attitudes. So this is, again, if you think about America's ideals, very often one of the ideals we're working against in these stories is democracy. Right? These are democratically elected people, undemocratically removed from office and replaced largely through U.S. help, all of which is justified at the time by the Cold War. Another major Cold War hotspot is Cuba. Cuba had always been an important relationship to the United States just because it's nearby. It's about 90 miles from Florida. There's always been a lot of American investment there. In the late 50s, Cuba fell to communism, which was obviously a troubling development for American Cold Warriors. And so American politicians and military leaders had an interest in trying to get the communists out of Cuba. And very often this led to some very tense and, in several cases, disastrous or nearly disastrous outcomes. So, for example, one thing the United States tried to do, again, largely through CIA organization, was invade Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. This was a disastrous fiasco in which American soldiers were arrested and rounded up by the Cuban government. It was a complete failure in its attempt to topple the Cuban government. We also got into a conflict with Cuba because American spy planes were able to determine that Cuba had Soviet atomic weapons stationed on the Cuban island. This is obviously troubling to the United States, that the Soviet Union would have missiles so close to the United States and potentially aimed at the United States. Now it's worth noting the United States had atomic bombs in the Soviet Union's neighboring countries. So again, from the Soviet Union's perspective, they're just evening the playing field here. But from the American perspective, this is a massive threat. And so this leads to this kind of standoff where the president at the time, John F. Kennedy, is telling the Soviet Union, get your missiles out of here. The head of the Soviet Union at that time, Nikita Khrushchev, is saying, well, you get your weapons out of there. Kennedy is, at least publicly, saying, we're not going to back down here. We're going to demand that the Soviet Union remove its weapons. And that is kind of what happened. What was less well publicized was that Kennedy also agreed to remove nuclear weapons from parts of Eastern Europe that were aimed at the Soviet Union. So this is kind of a bilateral agreement to pull weapons out and to avoid a greater escalation of Cold War tension. But again, for a few days there, when American people become aware that there are nuclear weapons 90 miles from Florida potentially aimed at the United States, it's just one more event where there's this kind of nuclear cloud hanging over American life at that time. So we'll pick up the story of the Cold War primarily by looking at Vietnam next week. So you can think of the Cold War as a global phenomenon, right, and that's what it was, but it also had all sorts of impacts on what's going on here in the United States, especially in terms of politics. If you think about politics in the decades after World War II, it's pretty different from today. For those of you who follow American politics today, one of the main characterizations of American politics today is polarization, deep, deep division between Democrats and Republicans. Well, back in the Cold War, it was kind of the opposite. There's very broad agreement on many aspects of politics, right? For example, Democrats and Republicans agreed that the Cold War is worth fighting. Democrats and Republicans agreed that communism abroad was a problem and that communism at home was a problem. Democrats and Republicans agreed about most aspects of the New Deal, like the importance of Social Security and other kind of government programs, the GI Bill, stuff like that came out of the New Deal. So, unlike today, where politicians primarily score points by always disagreeing with the other side, back then there's a great deal of overlap and agreement between Democrats and Republicans. And at the heart of that is the agreement that communism is bad, that we want to prevent it from spreading abroad, but we also want to keep it from spreading at home. And so there's just enormous levels of anti-communism in American politics, in American life, American popular culture. You can go on and on. So one of the big fears is espionage, is spying. And it is true that there was spying, right? One of the ways the Soviet Union was able to develop its atomic bomb so quickly is they had spies in the Manhattan Project. They were secretly funneling nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union and accelerating their nuclear program. One of the big stories at that time, again in 1949, the year of shocks, was this allegation that this guy Alger Hiss, who had been an official in the government dating back to the Franklin Roosevelt period, there were allegations that he was a communist spy. And one of the main investigators of that is a guy you see here looking much younger than you probably picture him if you had a mental picture of him. And that's Richard Nixon. This is kind of how Richard Nixon made his name back in the late 40s. Well, this guy Alger Hiss, who had, again, worked in the Franklin Roosevelt administration, he was widely suspected of being a spy, and decades later, when Soviet sources became available to historians, we pretty much confirmed that he was, to some extent, working with Soviet spies and with the communist sort of network of espionage. A few years after that, a husband and wife team, again, primarily the husband, Ethel Rosenberg, he was accused of nuclear espionage. Now, nobody suspected his wife Ethel, but the investigators figure, well, if we accuse her as well, it will pressure pressure Julius. I feel like I've been very confusing. Julius is the man who was accused of espionage. They put pressure on him by accusing his wife Ethel of being a spy as well. But Julius refused to confess, and he and his wife, who probably never participated in any espionage activities, were executed in 1953. So a very high-profile case, again, that seems to affirm the idea that there are at least some spies in the American government. Now, there is that kernel of truth there, right? There were spies, but what this led to is enormous amounts of hysteria and enormous amounts of false accusations that kind of ran ripples through all sorts of aspects of American life. So, for example, there's a lot of concern that there were communists in Hollywood. They were putting subtle pro-communist messages into Hollywood films and stuff like that. That's, I would argue, a much flimsier allegation than the actual reality of spies and the government. There were hearings, publicly televised hearings, in which movie stars and directors and producers were grilled by Congress and grilled by Senate committees. And the pressure here was basically to name names. Like, if you're called before one of these committees and you say, I've got nothing to do with any of this, they would say, well, this will go a lot easier for you if you can tell me some people that you think do have some sort of communist affiliation. And so people, in the interest of saving their own necks, they give names, and those people give names. Before you know it, there's this sort of mental image that there's just communists everywhere, and that a lot of these people have their good names destroyed, their careers ruined. Again, going back to Hollywood, a number of Hollywood producers and directors were what's called blacklisted, basically put on lists that said, don't hire this person, so their careers and their reputations are destroyed, even in cases where they have no affiliation at all to the Communist Party or to the communist movement in the Soviet Union. And this bleeds into all sorts of things. It bleeds into academia and schools. It bleeds into all sorts of areas of public life, where if there's even a little inkling that maybe you went to a workers' meeting in the 1930s, 15 years later, that could get you fired from your job, that could get your reputation destroyed. So it's just kind of rippling outwards in all sorts of ways. And there's Ronald Reagan. He's a good, famous example of a Hollywood actor who was put before one of these committees and named lots of names of people that he had suspected of communist ties. The result is just a popular culture that goes way in the other direction to hold the kind of the Cold War line of anti-communism, right? That anything that even a little bit resembled, let's say, a movie that celebrates the working man or makes a factory worker the hero, even stuff like that was seen as kind of unacceptable at the height of the Cold War in the early 50s. And the king of all this stuff was a guy named Joseph McCarthy, who kind of made his name by being the most aggressive and very often extremely careless accuser of people. He would go around, I have a list of 205 names of people in the government today who work for the Communist Party, whereas little to none of the people, he didn't even really have lists of 205 names, and when he did have lists of names, very often these people had nothing to do with the Communist Party or the Communist movement. But again, you're hauled before Joseph McCarthy's commission, you're kind of looking guilty whether you are or not, right? Sort of guilt by association. You're having your network, your name, and your reputation ruined. And so McCarthy kind of dominates politics for a few years in the early 50s, but he starts to get more and more careless. He starts to get more and more kind of clumsy in his accusations. And by 1954, he kind of goes after a target he probably shouldn't have, which is the U.S. Army. He claims the U.S. Army is infested with communists, which was not the case. He has no evidence for this stuff. But you can imagine, the average American in the 1950s, they love the Army, right? This is the Army that defeated the Nazis, that defeated Japan. And so for McCarthy to be up there very often on television, going on and on about the communist rot inside the Army, it kind of turns public opinion against him at last. And so a few years later, the McCarthy hysteria had kind of died down, and McCarthy himself drank himself to death within a few years. So you've still got this sort of atmosphere of broad agreement, right? Americans are pretty on board with anti-communism in general, but McCarthy in a lot of ways just kind of took it too far, right? Too many innocent people got swept up in the hysteria of his movement, that the average person kind of turned against that super exaggeratedly aggressive anti-communist tactic. But nevertheless, there was still broad agreement that communism was a problem, and that we should root communists or communist-leaning people out of many areas of public life. And again, we'll kind of look at some of this a little bit more again when we get to the Vietnam War next time. There's also, for the Cold War, kind of a more cultural aspect to this, right? By the end of the 50s, the Soviet Union had put the first artificial satellite into space called Sputnik. So again, there's all this anxiety that we're losing, right? We lost China, we failed to win in Korea, now they're kind of seemingly leaving us in the dust when it comes to scientific development. So there's just all this concern that the Cold War is just going to be the dominant factor in life for a really long time, and that we've got this big, looming enemy of the Soviet Union that we need to direct so much of our education system and our technology and our politics towards defeating. And that's going to continue on for a few more decades. Now, while there is this sort of atmosphere of anxiety and often hysteria related to communism in the 50s, there's also enormous levels of optimism which are rooted in real prosperity. If you look at the economic history of the United States, the decades following World War II are turning out to be somewhat unique. These are years in which the gap between the rich and the poor got smaller. It's a period where the middle class grew fantastically, where the average American person seeing their standard of living rise every year. And if you think about now, when there's so much pessimism about the economic future, the idea that, children will do better than their parents is no longer a commonly held belief in the United States. But back in the 1950s, this was just taken as gospel, right? That the United States has created an economy where the average person will rise above the level their parents achieved. Remember, these are people whose parents grew up like in the Great Depression and in the difficulties of World War II. They come out of World War II and the economy is totally humming. It had kind of gotten back on its feet through war production, but now after World War II, that production is going to continue, but primarily for consumer goods. Right? If you think about back to the 1920s, I talked about the idea that the economy starts to run on consumption, that we're buying stuff, and that's what's keeping the economy going. Well, that again becomes kind of a American gospel, right? It becomes your patriotic duty to buy stuff, to fill your home with appliances and gadgets and whatever else is available, and that there was a solid economic basis for that idea, right? The middle class is growing, wages are up, employment is high, so the economy is really doing pretty well in the decades after World War II. Here's a couple sections from American Yacht that explore that in more detail. If you want to picture the quintessential 50s story, it's pretty much taking place in the suburbs. The dominant process in global history for centuries had been urbanization, people moving from the countryside to the city. Well, at this point, there's an acceleration of kind of the opposite, which is people moving out of the city into the surrounding suburbs. And that's, the dream of the standalone home and the backyard and just the kind of quintessential American ideal. Of course, living in Houston, this is the product of that era, right? Where you just got vast stretches of single-family homes in every direction, and still we're kind of pursuing that goal as the metropolitan area expands. That sort of 1950s suburban idea is still what many people shoot for. So we've got this expanding suburbs based on this expanding middle-class economy. If one emblem of the 1950s economy is the suburban home, another one is the automobile, and again, that's been true since the 20s, as we talked about, but again, continues to expand and accelerate in the decades after World War II. What you see here is a 1951 Buick LeSabre. I want you to kind of keep this picture in mind. I'm going to come back to the Buick LeSabre in the end of the 1970s. I would look at this car as kind of a metaphor. It's kind of like a rocket ship, right? It's kind of blasting us into this optimistic future. I would argue this is a car made by optimistic people. When I show you a Buick LeSabre from 1979, I hope you'll see that it seems a lot less optimistic because it was produced in much less optimistic times. So not only are people buying cars, again, you need a car to live in the suburbs, as many of us Houstonians know. The United States is also investing massive amounts of money to build the American interstate highway system. And if you think back to the New Deal, the government spent all this money putting men to work to help raise the economy during the New Deal. Well, this Interstate Highway Act, which came out in the mid-1950s under Dwight Eisenhower's presidency, dwarfs any New Deal program. So in a way, this is a massive government jobs program that built the interstate highway system. So again, if you think about Houston, and you think about it as like a plus sign with I-10 going this way and I-45 going this way, that's the product of this Interstate Highway Act. And you can just sort of use your imagination to think about how many people were needed to build all of this, and then think about all the sort of stuff that gets built up around a car-based world and a car-based society, right? People don't want to get out of their cars, so we provide food that you can get through a drive-through. Again, something like McDonald's became a booming business in the 1950s. Or you think about a motel, right? You think about a hotel where you go into the lobby and you go up the staircase or whatever. Now we're going to build motels with a door faces the parking lot. So again, another way in which life is getting oriented around the automobile. And again, Houston's like the perfect example of what that creates. The reason Houston looks and feels very different from an older city like New York City or Boston that was built before cars became dominant. Why is all this happening, right? Why is the economy so good? Again, part of it is the after effects of World War II, where all these factories are up and running and people are earning good wages. They got money to spend, and so when they've got money to spend, businesses will boom that provide stuff, whether it's washing machines, television, stuff like that. It's also a really good time for organized labor. Workers really have a voice. We talked about unions back in week 2. At this point, a very significant fraction of American workers were in unions, so they're able to bargain with their bosses for better wages, shorter hours, better conditions, all the same stuff we saw workers trying to achieve back in the Gilded Age and back in the Progressive era. Today, something like 7% of workers are in unions. Back then, it was like 1 in 3. So there's a 1 in 3 chance if you were a working person back then, you had a union fighting for your wages and your conditions and all of that. So that really helps support middle-class lifestyles, right? Middle-class wages. And a lot of this is also supported by the government. Again, think about the GI Bill. The GI Bill coming out of World War II lets veterans go to college. That opens up a whole new generation of primarily men to get the college educations you need to get a lot of middle-class jobs, right? More and more jobs that require college educations, and the government's going to send those millions of men from World War II to go to get college educations for free. It also provided cheap home loans for veterans. So again, there's this whole generation of men who are able to leave the military, get an education, secure a middle-class job, buy a house out in the suburbs with a good interest rate. All of this provides this sort of firm foundation for a much stronger middle class than most Americans think we have today. So again, we'll kind of pick up that economic story when it starts to move the other direction in the 1970s. And then, last thing I want to look at is kind of the culture that's underlying all of this. If you think about 50s culture, post-World War II culture, to us, I think it looks very quaint and wholesome, and often it's like ridiculously so. If you've ever seen clips of Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best or something like that. If you think back to the 1920s, when the big communication development was the radio that kind of brings everyone together and gives us more of this sense of shared culture, for the 50s, it's the television, right? Television's become one of the big consumer items of that period. Looking back, I mean, this is it began as kind of a luxury item. If you think about, I haven't been to Best Buy for a while, but for a couple $100, you get a massive, 44-inch television, and for a little more than that, like a 70-inch television. In 1949, a 19-inch television cost $150. So that's over $1,000 in today's money to buy a little television, and yet that's something that most families decided they needed to invest in. And so by the 50s, virtually every suburban home has a television in it. And again, that gives us this sense of shared culture. There's typically, at most, 3 stations available, so everyone's watching the same stuff. And I would argue that's a big part of why there's so much broad agreement, because everyone's getting their information from the same sources, the same newspapers, the same television news. Of course, that's the exact opposite of today, where we all have literally individualized news feeds in our phones. I think that's part of why our culture today is so fragmented, and why it's so divided, is we don't have shared sources of trusted information. Whereas in the 50s, you had that very strongly. So we've got our television pumping out images of the very middle-class suburban lifestyle that people want to join, right? So it's all kind of self-fulfilling, right? You join the middle class, you get a television, you watch images of other middle-class people living their squeaky clean middle-class lives out in the suburbs. It all just creates this sense of consensus, that we're all on the same page, pursuing the same goals, fearing the same things, wanting the same things. Now, all that idea of being on the same page, of having this feeling of consensus, you take that too far, it can get kind of creepy, and there's an element of that, right? You look at that picture of the suburbs, it can be kind of depressing, right? Every house looks exactly the same, everyone's expected to dress the same, act the same. So all of this kind of has positives and negatives. Yes, it's true, there's this growing, broad prosperity, but there's also this kind of dark undercurrent of conformity, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. Again, here's a section of American Yacht. You can get some more information on this. Part of this also is a big surge in babies being born coming out of World War II. A lot of students tend to think of this as like, the men came home and they had babies with their wives. That's true, but that doesn't explain why they lasted for 15 years. Like, again, I would argue, this is a result of prosperity. When people have money to, like in the Great Depression, births went way down because times were uncertain and the economy was unstable. Now, prosperity, optimism, those are going to cause a lot of people to have kids. And then, again, you turn on your TV, you see a bunch of other families with children. It reinforces this idea that this is just what you do in the 1950s, right? You get your suburban home, you have your 2 to 3 kids, and you sort of live that dream as you see it on Leave It to Beaver or whatever. Another big part of that sort of 50s consensus idea is religion. Again, a big part of this comes from the Cold War. The Soviet Union was officially atheist and certainly non-religious in its elite. There certainly were religious people living within the Soviet Union, but the official stance of the Soviet Union was essentially anti-religious. And so a lot of Americans saw religion as a way to differentiate us from them, right? They're going to be godless communisms. We're going to be devout Americans. On your screen, you see a guy named Billy Graham, who was a famous minister on television. He was a figure in public life for many decades. He was a friend of many, an associate of many U.S. presidents, an enormously influential figure in Christianity. His son is still a prominent figure. Graham died. I should have known this before I started this lecture, but I think at like 99 or 100 a few years ago. But he had been really influential in American life for like 60 plus years. You start to see all these things coming together, right? So we have the automobile, we've got suburban home, we've got the nuclear family. Here we see a drive-in church. I've read there still are a couple of these out there, but if you think about kind of some of the big churches that develop in American cities today. Back then there's such an obsession with cars that people want to get their religion without even getting out of their car. So this stuff, in my opinion, becomes almost cartoonish, right? The car and the religion are so important, we're going to put them together, even if it doesn't really seem to me like anyone's idea of a satisfying spiritual experience. We've got all these ways in which America's kind of adopting these shared ideals. Again, the consumer economy, Protestant and Catholic Christian religion is pretty dominant in American public life. The suburban home, very set gender roles. We'll talk about that a little bit in the Week 5 lecture. You do start to see some people going against that, and a lot of that is coming from young people. Young people are looking at that Leave It to Beaver lifestyle that their parents are living, and it seems very boring and conformist. And for the first time ever, because there's so much prosperity, you've got kids with allowances, kids with money to burn. And so they're going to buy things like records of musicians that their parents don't like and stuff like that. It opens up this kind of generation gap between 50s youth and their parents. A lot of this comes from music, especially the popularization of rock and roll. If you go look at a clip of Elvis Presley, it might seem kind of corny to you today. But in the 1950s, for 50s parents, rock and roll is the devil's music. There's definitely a racial undercurrent to that. Rock and roll came out of very distinctly black music, right? So much so that sort of early pre-rock and roll music, kind of what they would have called rhythm and blues, those were literally marketed as race records, right? Records made by black musicians for black audiences. But by the early 50s, a growing number of white kids are listening to and excited by this music, one example being Elvis Presley. And so he kind of puts this music, or at least popularizes this music, in white suburban homes. And these sort of hand-wringing 50s parents can't believe their squeaky clean little kid is listening to Elvis Presley, or This Is Little Richard, you see on the left. But there's many examples, Jerry Lee Lewis, many musicians from that period, that again, to us might seem pretty tame, but at the time, were pretty culturally revolutionary. And so there's this kind of growing seeds of generational backlash here, and we'll see that really bear fruit when we get to the 60s and the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the hippies and all that stuff. All of that stuff kind of flowered out of the roots of this kind of youth rebellion in the 1950s. So we have this consensus Leave It to Beaver image, but there are some cracks in it. You see it in something like rock and roll. There's also a growing number of writers, poets, filmmakers, people like that. They're also rebelling against this very conformist, squeaky clean sort of 1950s image. So, for example, on the right, you see a group of writers known as the Beats. This is like Jack Kerouac, who wrote a really famous novel called On the Road, or the poet Allen Ginsberg. And in their writings, they're really critical of this boring, consumerist, conformist American mainstream life. And so again, that's going to bear fruit later too with the 1960s counterculture, again, hippies, stuff like that we'll talk about in the Week 5 lecture. So I'm going to end it there for now. If we think about where America stands at the end of the 1950s, I would argue it's kind of being pulled in two directions. On one hand, you do have this shared abundance, shared prosperity, shared optimism, relatively small amounts of political conflict. So there is this idea that America is on this really bright, shining path towards a very optimistic future. But you also do start to see some cracks within that. This idea that life of monotonous suburban living is not going to be for everyone. And as the world becomes more complex, it's going to really challenge that very limited idea of what American life is or could be. So we'll pick up that story and we can talk about the 1960s in the Week 5 lecture. So, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye.